A routine day begins to crumble. Margaret Johnson, a 70-year-old janitor at Briarwood Corporation, pushed her cleaning cart slowly down the pristine corridors of the corporate office building. Each step was measured, her joints aching as they always did after decades of hard work. For over 40 years, Margaret had been an unseen fixture at Briarwood, a quiet presence who kept the office spotless. She had seen the company grow from a modest startup to a corporate giant. Yet for all the years she'd spent ensuring its employees had a clean environment, to most, she was invisible. The elderly woman who mopped the floors and cleaned up after them, little more. As she rounded the corner, she took a moment to catch her breath, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. Her thoughts drifted to her grandchildren, the 3 children who had become her world after her daughter's sudden death 3 years ago. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming at times. Margaret had hoped to retire by now, but the cost of raising her grandchildren made that impossible. Her modest pension and Social Security couldn't cover everything, so she worked through the pain in her back, the constant fatigue in her bones. She reached the executive wing, her least favorite part of the building. It was where the bigwigs spent their days, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Margaret had no personal connection to these people, yet it was here that she often faced the most blatant disregard. Not all of them, of course. There were a few who acknowledged her, like Oliver, a young marketing associate who always had a kind word, but most treated her like part of the furniture. As she entered the luxurious restroom to begin her duties, she was unaware that this routine day would be the start of something that would alter the course of her life. A quiet greeting. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," a familiar voice said from behind her. Margaret turned to see Oliver Coleman standing in the doorway, his warm smile offering a rare moment of humanity in her otherwise mechanical routine. He was one of the few younger employees who treated her like a person, not just the janitor. "Good morning, Oliver," she responded, her voice tired but genuine. "How are you doing today? And how are those grandkids?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes full of genuine concern. "They're doing fine, growing up so fast. I can hardly keep up with them," Margaret replied, her lips curling into a soft smile, a rare expression these days. "As for me, well, you know how it is. One day at a time. You're amazing, Mrs. Johnson. I don't know how you do it," Oliver said with admiration. "You inspire a lot of people around here, even if they don't always show it." Before Margaret could respond, the moment was shattered by the sharp click of approaching footsteps, the sound of expensive shoes on the polished tile floor. It was a sound she dreaded. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the brisk, no-nonsense gait of Stephen Porter, the senior manager of the finance department. His presence always came with tension. The encounter. Stephen Porter, a tall, imposing man with graying hair and a permanent scowl, rounded the corner and saw Oliver chatting with Margaret. His eyes immediately narrowed, and his lips curled in disdain. He was the kind of manager who believed the world was divided into those who mattered, people like him, and those who didn't. "Coleman, don't you have work to do?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. Oliver straightened up, the easy smile on his face vanishing, as he quickly turned to face Stephen. "Yes, Mr. Porter. I was just heading back." "And you?" Stephen's eyes turned to Margaret, and they hardened, as if her very presence was offensive to him. "I've seen dust in the corners again. Make sure you clean properly this time, or I'll be speaking with your supervisor." Margaret lowered her gaze, gripping the mop handle tightly. "Yes, Mr. Porter. I'll take care of it." Stephen scoffed, rolling his eyes as if her words were an inconvenience, before storming off. Margaret let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her chest tightening with the familiar sting of humiliation. It wasn't the first time he had spoken to her like this, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Oliver hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking from Stephen's retreating form to Margaret. He gave her a sympathetic look, but said nothing more as he hurried back to his desk. As much as he wanted to say something in her defense, He knew it wouldn't do any good. Stephen Porter wasn't the kind of man to listen to reason, and speaking up could jeopardize his own position. Margaret's world. Alone once more, Margaret resumed her cleaning, though her hands trembled slightly as she wrung out the mop. She moved to the mirrors, spraying them with glass cleaner as her thoughts swirled. She had never imagined her life turning out this way. When she was younger, Margaret had hoped to travel, to spend her twilight years enjoying the fruits of a life well lived. But fate had other plans. With her daughter gone, she had become both mother and grandmother, working tirelessly to provide for her grandchildren. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, and the smell of industrial cleaner filled the air. She scrubbed the sinks methodically, her mind drifting back to a time when things were different. When she first started at Briarwood, it had been a much smaller company. Back then, the executives knew her name, asked about her family, and treated her with respect. But as the company grew, and as new management took over, the culture had changed. People like Stephen Porter became the norm, and Margaret became just another nameless cog in the machine. Her thoughts were interrupted by the door swinging open again. Margaret tensed, expecting to see Stephen Porter returning with more demands. But it wasn't him. A young woman with a kind face entered, glancing around as if checking to see if the coast was clear. It was Lily Summers, one of the junior executives, who often helped Margaret when no one was looking. A small act of kindness. "Mrs. Johnson," Lily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you all right?" Margaret blinked, surprised by the concern in the young woman's voice. She nodded, though the tightness in her chest remained. "I'm fine, dear. Just doing my job." Lily frowned, clearly unconvinced. "I heard what Mr. Porter said. He was out of line. You shouldn't have to put up with that." Margaret smiled weakly. "It's all right. I've been through worse." But Lily wasn't satisfied with that answer. "No, it's not all right. You've been here longer than most of us. You deserve better than this." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. She wasn't one to cry, especially not in front of anyone. "You're very kind, Miss Summers. But I've learned to keep my head down and just get through the day." Lily hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Then she stepped closer and pressed something into Margaret's hand. A small envelope. "This is for you," she whispered. "It's just a little something from a few of us who appreciate everything you do. Don't open it here, though." Before Margaret could protest, Lily hurried out of the restroom, leaving her standing there, stunned. She looked down at the envelope in her hand, feeling the weight of it. It wasn't much, just a small gesture, but it meant the world to her. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt seen. The storm approaches. As she tucked the envelope into her apron pocket and continued her cleaning, Margaret had no way of knowing that this small act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change everything. Stephen Porter's cruelty, the silent complicity of her colleagues, and the growing tension in the office would all come to a head soon. And Margaret Johnson, the quiet janitor whom everyone overlooked, would find herself at the center of it all. The burden of silence. The events of that fateful day in the restroom still haunted James Anderson as he sat at his desk, the clacking of keyboards around him failing to drown out his thoughts. Margaret Johnson's collapse weighed heavily on him. The guilt was like a knot in his stomach, and he knew he couldn't continue ignoring the moral dilemma gnawing at him every day. The small gestures of kindness he'd shown Margaret seemed pitiful now, mere band-aids on a much deeper wound. Margaret's absence was glaring, even in a company as large as Hartwell Industries. Without her, the office seemed slightly messier, a little less organized. But it was more than the physical tasks she performed. Margaret had been a silent but enduring presence, a steady rhythm in the office's heartbeat. Her absence was a reminder to James and others of the growing divide between those who worked in the shadows and those who thrived in the spotlight. And the silence that followed her collapse screamed louder than any words could. James found himself drawn into conversations with his colleagues, their whispered frustrations blending with the day-to-day routine. They all knew about Richard Blackwell's treatment of Margaret. And not just Margaret. There were countless others who had been humiliated, intimidated, and belittled by the man who ruled the department with an iron fist. "Do you think she'll come back?" asked Sarah, one of the younger accountants, during a lunch break. James shrugged. "I don't know. But if I were her, I wouldn't want to." Can you imagine being treated like that for years and no one doing anything about it? Sarah's tone carried a mixture of disgust and helplessness. James flinched. He didn't need the reminder of his own inaction, but he couldn't argue with her words. Margaret had endured far too much for far too long, and every day that passed without addressing the problem made James feel more complicit in her suffering. "Do you think we should report him?" Another colleague, Jason, piped in cautiously. The table fell silent. "Report Richard Blackwell." It was a thought they all had at some point, but no one had dared to say it out loud. To challenge Blackwell was to risk everything: jobs, reputations, livelihoods. They had heard stories of employees who crossed Richard only to mysteriously find themselves on the chopping block during the next round of layoffs. What good would it do? James muttered, the bitterness evident in his voice. The higher-ups don't care. They know what he's like, and they let him get away with it because he delivers results. Jason looked down at his sandwich. "Yeah, I guess you're right." Sarah sighed. "It just feels so wrong. Like we're all just sitting by, watching this happen, and doing nothing." James could hear the weight of her words, echoing his own internal conflict. He had sat in that restroom stall, listening to Margaret's humiliation, frozen in his own fear. And now, even as they sat here, discussing Richard's behavior, none of them were taking any action. Meanwhile, in a quiet hospital room across town, Margaret lay in bed, her body still weak from the collapse. The doctors had told her she was overworked, underrested, and dangerously close to a full-on breakdown if she didn't make some serious changes to her lifestyle. But how could she? She had 3 grandchildren to support, and retirement wasn't an option, despite the years she put in at Hartwell. Margaret stared at the ceiling, her thoughts drifting back to the countless nights she had stayed late at the office, mopping floors and scrubbing toilets, making sure the place was spotless before the executives arrived in the morning. The routine had been comforting, even though the work was hard and her body was constantly in pain. But now, the thought of returning to that office filled her with dread. She thought of Richard Blackwell, his sneering face, his cruel words, the way he had humiliated her in front of James, the accountant who had always been kind to her. How had things gotten so bad? She had given everything to that company, and in return, she had been treated like dirt. No one had stood up for her, not even the people she thought might care. Tears welled in her eyes, but Margaret blinked them back. She had cried enough over the years. It was time to think about her future, about what she wanted, not just for herself, but for her grandchildren. Maybe it was time to consider walking away from Hartwell. The thought scared her, but the alternative was even worse, continuing to endure Richard's abuse until her body finally gave out for good. Back at Hartwell Industries, Richard Blackwell continued to rule with his usual arrogance, completely oblivious to the undercurrent of discontent growing among his employees. The office buzzed with gossip about Margaret's collapse, but Richard paid it no mind. As far as he was concerned, Margaret's absence was one less problem for him to deal with. Richard's office was a shrine to his ego. Framed awards and certificates lined the walls, each one a testament to his ruthless climb up the corporate ladder. A photo of him shaking hands with the CEO hung prominently behind his desk, a constant reminder to anyone who entered that he was well-connected and untouchable. But despite his outward confidence, Richard couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The arrival of the new CEO, Mr. Harrison, loomed large over him. Richard prided himself on being able to manipulate his superiors, but from what he had heard, Harrison was different. A man with a reputation for valuing integrity over profit. That kind of leadership style was bad news for someone like Richard, who had built his career on stepping on others to get ahead. Richard tapped his fingers on his desk, contemplating his next move. He needed to solidify his position before Harrison arrived. Maybe it was time to push for another round of layoffs, get rid of some of the dead weight, make it clear that he was still in control. After all, the board trusted him to keep the department running efficiently, and a little house cleaning would only reinforce his authority. But just as Richard began drafting his list of potential targets, the door to his office creaked open. "Mr. Blackwell." Richard looked up to see James standing hesitantly in the doorway. "What is it, Anderson?" Richard snapped, annoyed at the interruption. James swallowed, his nerves on full display. I just wanted to talk to you about Margaret Johnson." Richard's face twisted into a sneer. "What about her? She's not here, is she?" "No, she's still recovering," James said, his voice shaky. "But I think we need to talk about what happened, about how you've been treating her." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Richard leaned back in his chair, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Anderson, I would be very careful about where you're going with this. If you're accusing me of something, you better be prepared to back it up with evidence." James hesitated, his mind racing. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, but he couldn't stay silent any longer. "I'm not accusing you, Mr. Blackwell. But I've seen how you talk to her, how you treat her, and it's not right." Richard's smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "Let me explain something to you, Anderson. This is a business. I run this department, and I run it well. If Margaret Johnson or anyone else can't handle the job, that's not my problem. My job is to make sure the work gets done, and if that means being tough on people, so be it." James stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come this far, but now, face to face with Richard, he realized just how powerless he was. He wasn't brave like the characters in the stories he loved to read, the heroes who stood up to bullies and won the day. He was just James Anderson, a low-level accountant with no real influence. I just thought you should know how some of us feel," James stammered, his confidence crumbling under Richard's withering gaze. Richard leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "Let me give you some advice, Anderson. You're new here, so I'll give you a pass this time. But if you want to keep your job, you'd better learn to mind your own business. People like Margaret Johnson are a dime a dozen. They come and go, and the company moves on. Don't make the mistake of thinking you're any different." James felt the air leave his lungs, the crushing weight of Richard's words sinking in. He had come to stand up for Margaret, but instead he was leaving with his tail between his legs, just like everyone else. As James walked back to his desk, he felt smaller than ever. Richard was right about one thing. In the corporate world, people like Margaret and James were expendable. The system was designed to protect people like Richard, and challenging it felt like an impossible task. But as he sat down at his desk, James couldn't shake the feeling that he had to do something. He had failed to stand up to Richard today, but that didn't mean he had to stay silent forever. Margaret deserved better. Everyone who had been mistreated by Richard deserved better. James opened his email and began drafting a message. He didn't know if it would make a difference, but he was done sitting on the sidelines. It was time to start fighting back, and maybe, just maybe, others would join him. Margaret sat in her hospital bed, staring out the window at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the buildings. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond Hartwell Industries, a life where she didn't have to endure Richard Blackwell's cruelty, where she could finally find peace. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see a nurse standing in the doorway with a visitor behind her. "Mrs. Johnson, you have a visitor," the nurse said with a smile. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as James stepped into the room, a bouquet of flowers in his hands. "Hi, Margaret," James said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of guilt and hope. I wanted to come by and see how you're doing. And to tell you that, I'm sorry. I should have done more, but I'm trying now." Margaret smiled weakly, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you, James. It means more than you know." James sat down beside her, the weight of the unspoken hanging between them. There was still a long road ahead, but in that moment, they both knew that they weren't alone. And maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. A ripple in still waters. The days that followed James Anderson's visit to Margaret's hospital room were filled with introspection. His steps back into the office felt heavier now, knowing he had to do more than just survive the grind. Something had shifted inside him, and he wasn't willing to let it fade. Margaret's fragile smile, her soft voice thanking him, played in his mind over and over. He had seen her strength for so long, the kind of strength that came with enduring endless abuse in silence. But silence wasn't strength, not anymore. It was surrender. And James had surrendered for far too long, like everyone else at Hartwell Industries. It started small. His email sat in his drafts for an entire day, each reread making him question whether he had the right to say these things. He thought about sending it anonymously, but ultimately scrapped the idea. His words had to carry the weight of his own name. After all, if he couldn't stand by his convictions, who would? The email was addressed to the company's HR department, but also CC'd to several department heads, even one of the board members. It was a detailed account of Margaret Johnson's mistreatment, but more than that. It highlighted a culture of fear that had allowed Richard Blackwell to thrive. James pointed out specific incidents, weaving the testimonies of colleagues who had quietly vented to him about Blackwell over the years. They had suffered in silence, but James was determined to make their voices heard. With a deep breath, he pressed send. At Hartwell Industries, the reaction was immediate. HR called James in for a meeting the following morning. He expected an intimidating panel of stone-faced executives ready to shut him down. But what he found instead was a lone HR representative, a middle-aged woman named Ruth, with tired eyes and a concerned expression. "Mr. Anderson," she greeted him, gesturing toward the seat across from her desk. "Thank you for coming in. I'm sure you know why we've called this meeting." James nodded, his palms sweaty as he sat down. Ruth sighed, looking over the printed copy of his email. "This isn't the first time we've heard about Mr. Blackwell's behavior. There have been whispers, but nothing concrete like this." "Then why has nothing been done?" James asked, his voice betraying his frustration. Ruth frowned. "Mr. Blackwell is a high performer. He's brought in millions in revenue, and upper management has always, well, they've turned a blind eye to his methods because of the results. It's the unfortunate reality of corporate life, Mr. Anderson. People like him often go unchecked because they deliver what the company wants." "At what cost?" James replied, his voice rising. Margaret Johnson collapsed from the stress he put her under. Countless others have quit or been pushed out, and now she's lying in a hospital bed while he continues to terrorize this office. Ruth leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "I'm not defending him. Believe me, we're not unaware of what's happening. But it's complicated. HR doesn't have the authority to remove someone like Mr. Blackwell without solid evidence and support from the board." "Evidence," James said incredulously. "I gave you evidence. Names, dates, incidents. What more do you need?" Ruth rubbed her temples. "We need a pattern, Mr. Anderson. We need more people to come forward, more complaints filed officially. Your email is a good start, but it's only a start. You're not the only one who's raised concerns, but without enough voices backing this up, the board won't act." James felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He had hoped that his email would be enough, that it would spark the change he so desperately wanted to see. But Ruth's words hit him hard. This wasn't a sprint. It was going to be a marathon. And there were no guarantees. "Then I'll get you more voices," James said, determination hardening in his chest. Ruth looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "If you can do that, Mr. Anderson, It'll be harder for the board to ignore. But be careful. Richard Blackwell has powerful allies. If you're going to do this, you need to be sure. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwell's arrogance remained unshaken. He was unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, too focused on his plans to consolidate power before the arrival of the new CEO. He had heard about Margaret's collapse, but as far as he was concerned, it was just another example of people who couldn't handle the pressure. The weak always fell away, leaving the strong to rise. But rumors had a way of spreading. James's email hadn't stayed confined to HR. Whispers filled the office, and soon enough, colleagues began looking at Richard differently. Conversations in the break room became cautious, laced with the fear of who might be listening. Some employees were emboldened by James's actions. Sarah, the young accountant who had once vented her frustrations, sent her own email to HR, outlining her own experiences with Richard. Jason followed suit. Slowly but surely, others began to step forward. Each story added another layer to the case against Blackwell. But the fear remained palpable. Richard was still powerful, still protected by the upper echelons of the company. And with the new CEO arriving soon, many employees were uncertain about their own futures. What if they were the ones who lost their jobs while Richard continued to thrive? Margaret was still in the hospital when she heard the news. James visited her regularly, and it was during one of these visits that he told her about his email, about the others who had started to follow his lead. Margaret listened quietly, tears welling in her eyes, as she realized that her suffering had not been in vain. "I don't know if it'll change anything," James admitted, staring at the hospital floor. "But I had to try." Margaret reached out and placed her hand on his. "You've done more than tried, James. You've given me hope, and that's something I haven't felt in a long time." For Margaret, the fight wasn't just about Richard Blackwell anymore. It was about reclaiming her dignity, about standing up for herself and the others who had been pushed aside. She knew she couldn't go back to Hartwell the same way she had before. If she did return, it would be on her terms, and she would not allow herself to be silenced again. Weeks passed, and the day of reckoning arrived. The new CEO, Mr. Harrison, made his grand entrance into Hartwell Industries. His reputation had preceded him, an outsider with a background in ethics reform and organizational accountability. He wasn't a typical corporate climber. He was known for cleaning house and restoring order to companies plagued by internal corruption. Richard Blackwell had prepared meticulously for this day. He had his numbers in order, his team briefed, and his presentation polished. He fully expected to impress Mr. Harrison with his department's stellar performance, despite the whispers that had been circulating about him. But what Richard didn't expect was the memo from HR waiting on his desk that morning. It was a summons. An investigation had been launched into the complaints filed against him. Multiple employees had come forward, and the company's board had approved a full review of Richard's behavior. The color drained from Richard's face as he read the memo. His carefully crafted world was beginning to crumble, and for the first time, he felt the cold grip of fear tightening around him. James sat at his desk, watching the flurry of activity as Mr. Harrison's arrival sent ripples through the office. He didn't know what would happen next, whether Richard would finally face consequences, or if the company would find some way to sweep it all under the rug. But he did know one thing. The silence had been broken. Margaret Johnson was due to be released from the hospital soon, and James had already spoken with her about her options. She wasn't sure if she wanted to return to Hartwell, but James had made her a promise. No matter what happened, she wouldn't have to face Richard Blackwell alone. And that was the beginning of something new, a small spark of resistance that, with time, might just become a fire. The gathering storm. Richard Blackwell sat alone in his corner office, staring at the memo from HR. The once invincible executive now felt the creeping unease of a man whose empire was under siege. It was impossible. He had done everything right, or so he thought. In his mind, he was the reason Hartwell Industries had thrived, the driving force behind its profits. Now, a handful of disgruntled employees were trying to tear him down. But something was different this time. The usual corporate whispers had grown into an unignorable hum, one that even his allies couldn't drown out. There were too many complaints, too many people speaking up, and the new CEO, Harrison, had a reputation for making bold, decisive changes. For the first time in his career, Richard felt real fear. James Anderson, unaware of Richard's growing paranoia, continued his quiet revolution. His email had not only sparked a chain reaction within the company, but had also transformed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. People who once avoided eye contact with him in the hallways now stopped him for whispered conversations, sharing their own experiences with the toxic work culture. Every day, more stories surfaced of gaslighting, intimidation, impossible deadlines, and, in some cases, outright harassment. It wasn't just about Richard Blackwell anymore. It was about an entire system that had enabled him and people like him to thrive. A system built on exploitation and fear. James had become something of an underground figure, a reluctant leader in a movement that was gaining momentum. But with that newfound responsibility came new challenges. He couldn't do it alone. The growing list of complaints needed coordination. More importantly, they needed to build a case strong enough to withstand the inevitable backlash from the board and Blackwell's supporters. That was when Sarah, the young accountant, approached him. "James, we need to organize," she said one afternoon, pulling him aside into a conference room. "What you did was brave, but we need more than brave emails if we're going to take down someone like Blackwell." James looked at her, surprised by her intensity. "What do you suggest?" "We need a coalition, a formal group of employees willing to back this up. Not just a handful of individual complaints, but a united front. People need to see we're serious, that this isn't just a few disgruntled workers making noise." James sat back, considering her words. "A coalition. Isn't that a bit risky? What if Blackwell finds out before we're ready?" Sarah crossed her arms, her expression firm. "He already knows. He may not know the specifics, but he can feel it. This is a war, James, whether you like it or not. And we need to be organized if we're going to win." She was right. James knew it, but the prospect of leading something so formal terrified him. He had never considered himself an activist or a leader. He was just a guy who had gotten fed up with the system. But now there was no turning back. Word of the coalition spread quickly. It began with small meetings after work, a group of employees gathering at a nearby cafe to discuss their experiences and their options. What started as 5 people grew to 10, then 20. The stories they shared were heartbreaking. Tales of emotional abuse, shattered confidence, and careers derailed by Blackwell's manipulations. Margaret Johnson's name came up often. Her collapse had become a symbol of the human cost of the toxic environment at Hartwell. She was still recovering, but her story resonated with everyone who had felt powerless in the face of the corporate machine. James found himself at the center of these meetings, even though he had never asked for the role. His quiet determination had become a beacon for others, and though he felt overwhelmed, he also felt a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about taking down Richard Blackwell anymore. It was about changing the culture at Hartwell for good. They drafted a formal letter, addressed to the board of directors and CEO Harrison, outlining the coalition's grievances. It wasn't just about Blackwell, though his name was front and center, but about the broader issues within the company, the lack of accountability, the culture of fear, and the systemic failure to protect employees from abuse. As they gathered signatures, James couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. People were no longer afraid to speak up. They were standing together, united in their demand for change. But James also knew that with every new signature, the stakes were rising. Richard Blackwell wasn't the type to go down quietly. Meanwhile, Blackwell was scrambling. Rumors of the growing coalition had reached his ears, and for the first time, he found himself on the defensive. He called in favors, leaned on his connections in upper management, and tried to discredit those who had spoken out against him. He even hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on James and other members of the coalition, hoping to find something, anything, that could be used to undermine their credibility. But it wasn't enough. The tide had turned, and Richard could feel the walls closing in. His once loyal allies were beginning to distance themselves, sensing that his reign of terror was nearing its end. And then, to make matters worse, there was the new CEO, Mr. Harrison. CEO Harrison had been watching the situation unfold from the moment he took over. He wasn't interested in the day-to-day office politics, but he was acutely aware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. The coalition's letter had reached his desk, and though it was still being reviewed by legal, Harrison had already made up his mind. Hartwell Industries needed a cultural reset, and Richard Blackwell was at the center of the problem. Harrison scheduled a series of private meetings with key members of the company, starting with James Anderson. When James was called into the CEO's office, he felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and anticipating all at once. The office was surprisingly unassuming. Harrison, a man in his late 40s with a reputation for reform, sat behind a modest desk, his expression unreadable as he gestured for James to sit. "Mr. Anderson," Harrison began, his voice calm but firm, "I've been following what's been happening with great interest. Your coalition has caused quite a stir." James nodded, unsure of what to say. He had never imagined sitting face to face with the CEO. "I'm not here to reprimand you," Harrison continued. "In fact, I think what you and your colleagues have done is commendable. It takes courage to stand up in the face of corruption, especially in a place like this." James felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Harrison was on their side. "But," Harrison added, leaning forward, "this is delicate. We need to handle this carefully. The board is not easily swayed, and Blackwell still has his supporters. If we're going to make changes, they need to be decisive and irrefutable, which is why I'm asking for your help." James blinked, caught off guard. "My help? What do you need from me?" "I need you to keep doing what you're doing," Harrison said. "But I also need something more. I need you to gather more concrete evidence, something we can use to force the board's hand. The coalition is a start, but we need to seal Blackwell's fate with undeniable proof." James's mind raced. "What kind of proof?" Harrison smiled slightly. "Anything that shows a clear violation of company policy, something we can't ignore. Emails, recordings, financial misconduct, anything. Can you do that?" James hesitated. This was a new level of risk, one that could backfire if he wasn't careful. But he also knew that Harrison was right. They needed more than just complaints. They needed a smoking gun. "I'll do what I can," James said finally. Harrison nodded. "Good. I'll be in touch." As James left the CEO's office, the weight of what he had just agreed to settled on his shoulders. The battle was far from over, but now he had an unlikely ally. Harrison had given him a lifeline, but it came with a dangerous task, one that could either bring Richard Blackwell down for good or destroy everything James and the coalition had worked for. The storm was gathering, and James was right at the center of it. Smoke and mirrors. The coalition's growth had become unstoppable. What began as hushed conversations over coffee had morphed into a full-fledged movement. Employees from all over Hartwell Industries, department heads, assistants, engineers, janitors, joined the ranks of those seeking justice. The whispered confessions had become rallying cries, and the email thread James had started now resembled a labyrinth of carefully documented grievances, each one building toward a tipping point. But for James, the weight of his new responsibility was nearly unbearable. Late nights blurred into early mornings as he sifted through emails, digging for the evidence Harrison needed. Every meeting with the coalition felt heavier, the stakes higher. The more momentum they gathered, the closer they got to their goal, but also the more dangerous the game became. Richard Blackwell wasn't just a bully. He was a cunning and vindictive man with deep ties to the board, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. Sarah, the young accountant who had been the first to suggest organizing, became James's closest ally. She had a knack for gathering information, and her attention to detail was invaluable. Together, they set about digging through old company records, looking for financial discrepancies that could further incriminate Blackwell. If there was one thing that could convince the board to sever ties with a man like Richard, it was proof that he was messing with the company's bottom line. One evening, as they pored over financial reports in Sarah's apartment, they found something unusual. A series of payments flagged under miscellaneous expenses in the corporate budget. Sizable sums of money, all allocated to obscure third-party vendors. The names of these vendors seemed innocuous enough at first glance, but something about them didn't sit right with Sarah. "These companies don't exist," she said, her voice laced with suspicion. James looked up from his laptop. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've cross-referenced their names with registered businesses in the area. And there's nothing. No websites, no tax records, no addresses. They're ghosts." James leaned forward, the adrenaline kicking in. "Do you think this is Blackwell's doing?" "I wouldn't be surprised," Sarah replied. "These transactions are too neatly hidden for them to be mistakes. It's a classic shell game. But we need more than this. If we can trace the money back to him, we might have the smoking gun." They spent the next week working late into the night, chasing down every lead. Slowly but surely, a pattern emerged. The phantom vendors weren't just random names. There was a trail, a faint but unmistakable thread that led back to a private account, one that Richard Blackwell controlled. Richard, meanwhile, had become a man under siege. Every day brought new rumors, new whispers of dissent spreading through the company. His once loyal allies had grown distant, his meetings with the board increasingly terse. The HR complaints were stacking up. And now CEO Harrison seemed unusually interested in how things were running in his division. It was as if the walls were closing in on him. He had heard about the coalition forming under James Anderson's leadership. He had tried to undermine it with whispers of his own, spreading rumors that Anderson was unstable, that the coalition was nothing more than a group of malcontents looking for a scapegoat. But it wasn't working. Too many people had experienced his methods firsthand, and too many others had heard the stories. He knew he had to act, and fast. James didn't know it yet, but Blackwell had started playing dirty. His private investigator had already compiled a dossier on James, pulling up every minor infraction, every embarrassing personal detail that could be used against him. He had dug deep, even going as far as contacting some of James's old colleagues, looking for any skeletons in his closet. What Blackwell didn't count on was that James's life, though far from perfect, was clean enough to withstand scrutiny. The best they could come up with was an unpaid parking ticket from years ago and a few embarrassing social media posts from his college days, hardly enough to ruin his reputation. But Blackwell had never relied solely on facts to get his way. He had begun planting rumors, subtle, insidious ones, that suggested James was angling for a leadership position within the company, using the coalition as a stepping stone to further his own career. The whispers started small, but they grew louder with each passing day, reaching the ears of some in the coalition who were already nervous about the risks they were taking. "Have you heard what people are saying?" Sarah asked one day, her voice tense, as she sat across from James in the cafe where they often met. James frowned. "What do you mean?" "They're saying you're just doing this to take Blackwell's job, that you're using all of us to climb the corporate ladder." James's stomach turned. "That's ridiculous. You know that's not true." "I know, but people are getting nervous. Some of the newer members are starting to question if this is really about changing the company or just about you." James felt the weight of those words sink in. This was classic Blackwell, sowing division and distrust from the inside. He knew how to turn people against each other with nothing more than a well-placed rumor. "We can't let him win," James said, his voice firm. "We're so close, Sarah. We just need to stay united a little longer." Sarah nodded, but the doubt in her eyes was clear. They both knew that Blackwell's tactics could tear the coalition apart from within if they weren't careful. The pressure was mounting on all sides. The coalition's evidence against Blackwell was strong, but not yet definitive. Harrison continued to encourage them, but his patience was wearing thin. The board was growing restless, wanting to see results, and James knew they were running out of time. Then, one day, James received an email that changed everything. It was from Margaret Johnson. The name alone sent a jolt through him. Margaret had been one of the earliest casualties of Blackwell's reign of terror, a brilliant project manager whose mental breakdown had been the catalyst for so many others to come forward. She had been on extended medical leave for months, recovering from the toll the company had taken on her. Her email was brief but direct. "James, I've heard what you and the others are doing. I want to help. I have something you need to see." James wasted no time. He arranged to meet Margaret at a quiet, out-of-the-way cafe, far from the prying eyes of Hartwell employees. When she arrived, she looked better than he had expected, still fragile, but with a sense of determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I'm not going to lie," she said as she sat down. "It's been a long road back. But I'm not here to talk about me. I'm here to talk about Richard." James listened as Margaret told him what had happened in the weeks leading up to her breakdown. She had been in charge of a major project, one that was integral to Hartwell's future. But when she had started asking questions about certain budget anomalies, Richard had intervened. He had shut her down, reassigned her team, and eventually forced her out. "I have proof," she said, pulling a small battered USB drive from her purse. "Emails, internal memos, even some audio recordings. Blackwell tried to bury this project because he was skimming from the budget to fund his own ventures. He used me to cover his tracks, and when I got too close, he made sure I was gone before I could expose him." James felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the smoking gun they had been searching for. As James walked out of the cafe that day, the USB drive in his pocket, he knew the game had changed. Blackwell's days at Hartwell Industries were numbered, but the final confrontation was still ahead. With Margaret's evidence, they could finally expose Blackwell for who he really was. But James also knew that the closer they got to victory, the more dangerous things would become. Blackwell wasn't going to go down without a fight, and James had a sinking feeling that the battle was about to get a lot more personal. The storm was no longer just gathering. It was here. Shadows unveiled. The morning light streamed through the windows of James's small apartment, casting long shadows across the floor as he stood at his kitchen counter, staring at the USB drive Margaret had given him. The weight of what was inside seemed almost tangible, as though the tiny piece of plastic and metal contained all the years of corruption and deception Hartwell Industries had allowed to fester under Richard Blackwell's reign. James knew this evidence could be the turning point, but with it came a new set of risks. He couldn't help but think back to the coalition meetings where the excitement of the movement had been palpable. Back then, it had felt like they were a group of underdogs rising against a tyrant. Now, though, with the truth so close at hand, the stakes had transformed. The movement was no longer just about improving conditions at Hartwell. It was about dismantling Blackwell's entire empire. And Blackwell would do anything to stop them. James called Sarah to share the news. She arrived at his apartment an hour later, looking both excited and nervous. "Are you sure this is real?" she asked, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table. "Margaret's been through a lot. I mean, I trust her, but—" James nodded. "I've looked through some of it. The documents are legitimate. Emails between Richard and the project leads, internal memos redirecting funds, and the audio recordings. Well, let's just say Blackwell doesn't sound like someone who expected anyone to hear them." Sarah's eyes widened. "This is it, then. We have him." "Almost," James said cautiously. "But it's not over yet. We can't just go to Harrison with this and hope for the best. We need to make sure we handle this the right way. Blackwell has friends on the board. If we're not careful, this could still blow up in our faces." Sarah leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "So, what's the plan?" The plan unfolded over the next week, meticulous and carefully calculated. Sarah, with her keen eye for detail, helped James compile the most damning pieces of evidence into an airtight case. They needed more than just proof of financial misconduct. They needed a narrative, something that would make it impossible for even Blackwell's most loyal allies to defend him. James and Sarah worked day and night, gathering corroborating testimony from other employees who had witnessed Richard's more egregious actions. Some were hesitant, but with the evidence Margaret had provided, most were willing to speak out. Slowly, a tapestry of corruption began to take shape, one thread pulling on the next until it was clear just how deep Blackwell's influence ran. Their final step was to approach Harrison, the CEO. He had been an ally in spirit, but his position meant he had to be careful about how he handled internal matters. James knew that presenting the evidence to him would force his hand, but it also put Harrison in a delicate spot. If he acted too aggressively, the board could turn against him. If he hesitated, Blackwell would have time to retaliate. So James and Sarah prepared for the meeting, knowing that it could go either way. The day of the meeting arrived with a tension that James could feel in his bones. He stood in front of Harrison's office door, the USB drive in his pocket feeling like it weighed a ton. Sarah stood beside him, her expression determined, though her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. "You ready?" she asked, her voice low. "As ready as I'll ever be," James replied, trying to steady his nerves. They stepped into Harrison's office, greeted by the man himself, a tall, imposing figure with silver hair and sharp eyes. He gestured for them to sit, his face unreadable. James felt a rush of uncertainty, but he pushed it aside. They had come too far to back down now. "What's this about?" Harrison asked, leaning back in his chair, his gaze steady on James. James took a deep breath. "It's about Richard Blackwell. We have proof that he's been embezzling company funds, intimidating employees, and using his position to cover up his actions." He handed Harrison the USB drive, watching as the CEO's expression remained neutral, though his eyes flicked toward the small device with interest. Harrison plugged it into his computer, the screen casting a faint glow over his face as he began reviewing the files. For several minutes, the room was silent, save for the faint clicking of the mouse as Harrison scrolled through the documents. James and Sarah exchanged a glance, both of them waiting for some kind of reaction. Finally, Harrison leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he regarded them. "This is serious," he said, his tone measured. "If this gets out, it's not just Blackwell's job on the line. It could damage the entire company's reputation." James nodded. "We understand that, but Hartwell's reputation is already at risk because of him. If we don't act, this will only get worse." Harrison sighed, rubbing his temples as though the weight of the decision had already settled on his shoulders. "The board won't like this," he said quietly. "Blackwell has powerful friends. They'll push back hard." "Let them," Sarah interjected, her voice fierce. "We have the truth on our side. And it's not just us. There are others. Employees who've been bullied, harassed, and threatened by Blackwell. They're ready to speak out if we give them the chance." Harrison was silent for a long moment. Then finally, he nodded. "All right. I'll call an emergency board meeting. But you both need to understand, this won't be easy. Blackwell will fight back with everything he has." "We know," James said, his voice steady, "but we're ready." As they left Harrison's office, James felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The meeting had gone as well as they could have hoped, but they were far from out of the woods. The board meeting would be the real test, and Blackwell wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Meanwhile, Blackwell was already getting wind of the storm brewing around him. His assistant, a man whose loyalty had been bought years ago, had overheard whispers from Harrison's office. He rushed to Blackwell's side, spilling what little information he had gathered. "They're going after you," the assistant said breathlessly. "And it's not just rumors this time. They have evidence, real evidence." Blackwell's face twisted into a sneer. "Of course they do," he muttered. "That little rat James Anderson is behind this, isn't he?" The assistant nodded. "And Sarah, she's been helping him. They're planning to present everything to the board." Blackwell stood, pacing behind his desk. He had been in tight spots before, but this felt different. The usual tricks weren't working. James had rallied more support than he had expected. And if the board saw the evidence, he slammed his fist on the desk, his anger boiling over. "No, I won't let them take this from me." He turned to his assistant, his voice low and dangerous. "Get me everything you can on Anderson and Sarah. I don't care how you do it. If they want to play dirty, then so will I." The days leading up to the board meeting were a whirlwind of preparation and paranoia. James felt as though he was constantly looking over his shoulder, half expecting Blackwell to retaliate in some underhanded way. He was certain that if Blackwell had any dirt on him, now was the time he use it. But Blackwell's usual methods of intimidation weren't working. The coalition was too large, too organized, and too determined to be shaken by his usual tactics. And with Harrison now on their side, they had the backing of the company's leadership. The board meeting was set for Friday afternoon. As the hour approached, James felt the tension rising like a wave, threatening to crash down on him at any moment. But he held firm. He and Sarah had prepared for this. They had the evidence. They had the truth. All that was left was to face Richard Blackwell and finally bring him down.